So it turns out my dad is not a hippie, or was a hippie. Hi, my name's Paul Klein. The decade that I focused on was the 1970s. The person I interviewed was Doug Klein. He was my father. Doug Klein was born on September 4th, 1955. He grew up in a small town in New Jersey and was a high school student then throughout the 70s. He had a TV which was black and white, a typewriter, and a record player. Some of the things I'm going to focus on are the social, historical, and political events that were prevalent back in the 70s, as well as the differences and similarities between growing up then and growing up now. My dad was really big into the Beatles. The Beatles actually, they started in the 60s, but they were really big into the 70s. The Beatles was basically a British invasion that led to the worldwide influence of popular music. That's how big they were. My dad was not into disco. Disco was really big in the 70s. He was a little bit too young for that, and he just did not like the whole disco scene. My dad was also not into the whole hippie drug culture. He didn't do any drugs, and he was a little bit too young for Woodstock, so he wasn't a part of that, and just wasn't a part of that whole scene. He was some of the other political and historical events that were prevalent were the Vietnam War. My dad remembers how big that was. They followed it on the news. He was too young for the draft, so that didn't have an impact on him. He didn't have to worry about being drafted for the war. He was just a little bit too young for that. However, they did follow it on the news, his family. He remembers he was also too young for the protests. He remembers a lot of the protests going on, but he was too young to participate in that. And just didn't participate in that. He remembers the withdrawal of the troops when that finally happened and how big of an event that was. Some of the other events were the oil crisis of 1973 and 1978. This affected Doug's family directly because it caused gas prices to rise drastically. So they had to pay extra money for gas, which was hard for them at the time. They were a middle-class family. My dad was big into the New York Yankees, being that he lived in New Jersey. He was a huge baseball fan, and the Yankees were a part of his life. He also remembers the American hostage crisis. It's when Americans were taken hostage at the Iranian embassy, and this went on for several weeks, and it was a huge media event, and they followed that, and they were eventually, all the hostages were eventually released. Also, the resignation of Richard Nixon. This went on for about 2 years, but was a huge story in the media, the whole resignation of Richard Nixon. Some of the biggest differences between growing up now and growing up then would have to be technology. Technology is huge in our world today. Back then, they did not have personal computers, cell phones, iPads, any of that. My dad used a typewriter for school, and he had to use whiteout whenever he had a mistake. So that's what he used for his school assignments. He had a typewriter. There was no computers, no internet, no cell phones. They had pay phones, so if you wanted to get a hold of someone, you had to contact them on a pay phone. My dad listened to music on a record player. Nowadays, you can download music instantly from wherever you are and listen to it on multiple devices. And back then, you would get a newspaper daily. The paper boy would deliver the newspaper, and everyone got one. Nowadays, newspaper's about to die. It's slowly fading out, and most people don't even get a newspaper anymore. They just check the news via internet or their TV. There was also not a 24-hour news program back then. There was just one evening news program that happened every evening. Now there's a 24-hour news program with sports and different forms of news. He had a black and white TV then. Nowadays you have high definition televisions. The world basically, according to Doug, has become much smaller. People communicate instantly with each other via Facebook, cell phones, text messaging, Skype, and all around the world they can communicate with each other. The movies and music are much more graphic nowadays. Things that are said on basic television now, some words that are used, you couldn't dream of saying those back in the 70s. It just would, yeah, that would never happen. Some of the similarities, we still use fax machines. My dad used fax machines back in high school in the 70s, and we still use fax machines. Businesses everywhere still use fax machines on a daily basis. We still use fax machines. And another similarity, people still want the news as fast as possible. You know, people want their news and they want it now. And they want to know what's going on with other people. You know, who's doing what, what's going on as fast as possible. So, this is the end of my video. I summarized some of the big political, social, and historical events that occurred back in the 1970s. I also told you about some of the differences between growing up now and growing up then. And some of the big, and that was basically technology. Technology has changed drastically between now and the 70s. So it makes you wonder what is going to be, how technology is going to change in 20 years from now. What my children are going to be saying if they have to do an interview like this. Thank you.